Hey there, folks. Now, winter is a great time to start planning out your kokanee adventures for the next year. So I thought I'd go over my top 10 choices for kokanee destinations in the Pacific Northwest in 2024. Now, this is based on some of my experience from last year and catching last year's fish and the next year's fish in those lakes as well, which are going to be the big fish we're going to be after this year, but also looking at reports and also looking at what kind of fish are being caught even now in the winter season, either through the ice or on open water. And I took a bunch of these different factors together to come up with my top 10 kokanee fisheries for 2024. So let's just jump right in. And the first one is going to be Lake Roosevelt. Now, Lake Roosevelt is well known as one of the best places to catch really big kokanee in the Pacific Northwest. It's located in north central, northeastern Washington. It's an extremely large reservoir, and for the past couple of years it's been pretty tough fishing there. It's a lot of really nice rainbow trout, but the bigger kokanee have been harder to come by. But this winter in particular, the 2023-2024 winter, I'm already seeing a lot more consistent action out on that lake. Fish in the 17 to 21 inch plus range size. And so I think this fishery is actually going to kick off really well this year and should definitely be high on your target list if you want to get into some trophy-sized kokanee. Now remember, the fish are going to be more up lake from Keller's Ferry up towards Lincoln during the wintertime and early spring, and then as they draw down the reservoir, those fish will move down towards the dam, and then once they start filling the reservoir back up, they'll start to spread back up lake again. But in general, the fishing is best from Lincoln downstream. You don't see as many of these really big kokanee in the upper portion of that reservoir. So that's my number one choice if you want to get into some really big kokanee. Also in Washington State is my number two choice is Lake Chelan. Lake Chelan is a huge natural body of water in the central part of the state. And last year, this lake actually started to cycle up on its average size. Generally, the fish in that lake are quite diminutive, although the quality of their flesh is really good just because the water quality in that lake is so amazing. It's so clear. And, last year we were seeing fish in the 14 to 16 inch range, and going into the fall and winter fishery, we're still seeing fish in that 14 inch range class, which just means we're going to see 14 to 16 inch fish again next year. And they're just huge numbers of fish in that lake. It was easy limits on the lower basin, especially in the spring and through the summer. So definitely put that one on your list if you want lots of really good action. It really contrasts well with Lake Roosevelt, where you're only allowed to keep 2 wild fish. They aren't really putting hatchery fish in there anymore. So if you do encounter a clipped kokanee in Lake Roosevelt, you can keep that on top of your 2 wild fish limit. But I've only seen like 1 or 2 of those come out in the last few years. But Chalan, you're going to have that nice 10 fish limit. They're fat, delicious, and really healthy fish. All right, now we're going to go north of the border into British Columbia, where I have 3 lakes that I would put on my hit list, and I'm going to go back and hit them again too because the fishing was so good there last year. And that is my number 3 choice is going to be Deca Lake. Now, Deca Lake is in the Caribou region. It's a large lake again. It's actually 2 lakes connected by a little canal. That canal is very shallow and marked with buoys, so be really cautious if it's your first time navigating it. It might be good to get out there in the daytime and learn how to navigate that before you try to do it early morning, low light. But in general, the big lake, Big Deca, which is you have to go through the canal to reach, has some of the largest fish. And last year I was encountering fish in the 17 to 19 inch range class, and there's some really quality kokanee. They cut really well. That lake just drains nothing but wilderness. It's a very beautiful location with really good fish. So that one's my number 3 choice. Nearby, my number 4 choice would be Bridge Lake. This is also a more challenging kokanee fishery. I found the fish there to be very fickle, very early morning bite. They tend to feed in the basins that lie in between the many islands that are in that lake. So finding them can be a bit tricky, but if you can get into a good bite, there's some really nice fish there, and quality fish again in that 17, 18 inch range class, although I did hear of a few fish 20 inch plus coming out of there. My next lake is also in the Caribou, and this is Horse Lake. I didn't get an opportunity to fish it last year because of inclement weather. It's also one of these fisheries that you aren't necessarily going to punch up a bunch of numbers, but if you do get into fish, they're going to be very large. This lake is a very long east-west lake, and it seems like most folks are just trolling right down the middle for them. But when they are finding these fish, again, we're seeing fish in that 17 to 20 inch range class with a few fish bigger than that. So all three of those lakes, Horse, Bridge, and Deka, are all very doable from any one of the many resorts in that region, and they're all within an hour of each other, so it's really easy to fish all of those from a single home base. And there's of course numerous other lakes up there too that all have kokanee that are worth checking out as well. Okay, next we're going to jump down into Idaho, and again I'm going to put Anderson Ranch high up here in my top 10 list because even though the fishing isn't as good as it has been in the past, the average size of fish in there has been really good and consistent. So again, we're seeing those fish in that 16 to 18 inch range class still being relatively common, and there might still be some bigger fish in there. But again, this is a really productive fishery. Myself and my followers have been out there and they've been hammering good numbers of large kokanee, and I expect that reservoir to still be one of the best large kokanee reservoirs in Idaho. The other reservoir I'm going to add onto this list is going to be Hayden Reservoir, Hayden Lake up in North Idaho. Now, the fish here are not necessarily as large, although you will find fairly easy and consistent limits on this lake, but it's also one of those lakes that mysteriously kicks out a few large kokanee every year. And so, I've fished Hayden several times, and on a couple of those occasions, I'll come into contact with a 17 or 18 inch fish in there. Sometimes I see 20 inchers pulled out of there. So it's one of those bodies of water that has the potential to produce big fish, but it's also going to give you really consistent action. So it keeps you busy, lots of catching, a good place to target some nice sized kokanee in North Idaho. Next, we're going to dip down into Oregon. And I think Detroit's going to be one of the better reservoirs this year. I'm seeing really good, consistent winter catches already. And with many of the other kokanee fisheries sort of on the decline in Oregon, Detroit's one of those shining stars. It has a lot of healthy fish. They're not going to be necessarily huge. Most of them are going to be in that 14 to 16 inch range class, but really consistent action and a really easy lake to fish. They tend to concentrate in the areas around the island or along that south shore. It's one of my favorite places to target kokanee in the Willamette Valley, and I think it's going to be a consistent producer again this year. Another lake that I think is worth fishing in Oregon this year is going to be Wickiup Reservoir. Now, Wickiup formerly produced really large kokanee consistently, but the drought and changes in water management strategies at that reservoir have led to some pretty record drawdowns in that reservoir. But remarkably, the kokanee have clung on in that lake, and last year we saw pretty good catches, especially early season. It wasn't necessarily red hot, but there were fairly large fish in the 17 to 19 inch range class being caught, and fair numbers of 14 to 16 inch fish. Also, I know several anglers who went down there in the fall, so they saw good numbers of the fish spawning in the streams that fed into that lake, and it also gets a little bit of spillover from Crane Prairie. So I actually think that we're getting a big blast of snow right now. Snowpack's probably going to be okay for this winter. I think Wickiup's gonna be coming back. I'm predicting that reservoir is going to return to its former glory, and I'm really excited to see what kind of fishing that lake produces this year. And the final lake on my list is going to be Whiskeytown Reservoir in Northern California. Last year, that lake started kicking out some 16 to 17 inch fish and really consistent numbers of 14 to 16 inch fish. It's already fishing really well this winter, so I'm really excited to see what that lake is capable of producing this year. I think it's going to be one of the shining stars on the southern edge of the Pacific Northwest. It'll also be one of the first lakes to turn on just because it's more southerly down there around Redding. In general, the upper end of the lake is one of the most productive kokanee areas, as well as the Whiskey Creek arm. You won't see a lot of boats trolling out in the middle of that reservoir. They tend to be holding on those extreme upper ends or that arm of Whiskey Creek. So a really good lake to put on your hit list, especially if you're looking for an early season spot. Lots of campgrounds around the lake, etc. All right, that's my top 10 for 2024. I definitely had some omissions in there. People are going to wonder about Wallowa. I think the days of the really big fish at Wallowa are gone. There are obviously some other lakes that are probably not going to be worth fishing this year, like Green Peter, and Merwin seems to be on the decline in terms of average size there. The fish just seem to be getting smaller and smaller. It's fishing more like its sister reservoir, Yale Reservoir upstream, where the fish are really stunted. So I don't know what's going on with that fishery, but there's lots of other opportunities out there too on smaller bodies of water that get stocked annually that didn't make this list. But if you could hit just even a handful of those lakes in my top 10, I think you're going to have a really great kokanee year. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Just remember, fish smarter, not harder. Bye.